Right. So before we get started, does anybody want to talk about anything in terms of like therapy or psychodynamic stuff, or other things than the lecture content? We can take a few minutes to address any questions or get into anything like that, or maybe not. We usually just get right into it. Okay, awesome. Okay. So last lecture we talked about there was a lot of history. And, dude, I'm like so technologically. What is it? Yeah,
Have Tim do it. He's really good.
Rather IT guy.
That's Okay, so I mean, I guess generally what we're talking about in these lectures, we met last week, then there's today, and then there's the next week, and we're just really trying to understand ways in which psychiatry and ideas about the mind and the self and our science in general are not just kind of objective and kind of created in a lab somewhere that's kind of immune from social, political, economic influences. And there's like actually a deeply violent history kind of at the heart of what we call modernity. And we went into a lot of kind of this history. Last lecture, we talked about colonialism, we talked about race, the idea of race and how that was invented in a particular violent context, initially to describe phenotypic differences between the colonizer and the colonized. And it was there to justify and legitimate the domination kind of relations that were there. And that's how it was that's how it arose, and it's got way more sophisticated and developed, and we're going to talk more about that. And then also we went into the way that Europe became at the center of the world. Colonialism basically was global, and the ideas that arose with colonialism that justified Eurocentrism also exerted their influence very powerfully across the globe. So here we were getting some binary, what it means to be white versus what it means to be non-white. You got the rational versus the irrational. You got the primitive versus the civilized, and you're getting a whole kind of set of ideas about what it means to be human that seemed kind of neutral, but they arose in this kind of very violent context, and they were reliant on a denigration of the colonized other. And one interesting idea that we kind of talked about is a new kind of temporal perspective on history, where basically the idea was that the way that history progresses is you very naturally go from primitive and then to like civilized, like very naturally, inevitably, like you just kind of evolve, and you go from color to European. And the Europeans were kind of the protagonists and the creators of modernity. And the primitive or the colored was in the past in relation to the European. So you have this kind of new developmental kind of social Darwinist perspective on history, and it's baked into psychology, it's baked into psychoanalysis. That's where you get ideas about primitive defense mechanisms. So these weren't just kind of abstract kind of ideas. These were ideas that were absorbed into the common sense of people worldwide. And they go into our psychiatry and our knowledge practices too. We talked about a little bit of some racial science. So we talked about drapetomania, which is a disease in the brain, right? It's a biological disease of when a slave tries to run away from captivity, right? So this was very well respected, common diagnosis. It was, it wasn't just like a racist doctor, right? This was like the air that they were breathing. This was the water that they were swimming in. These were very common ideas, and they couldn't see it the way that we see it now, right? So it's not just an individual racist, it's institutionalized racism. And we'll go into that means from a quote by Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, who describes it as a less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but no less destructive to human life. And it's kind of like the silent racism of established and respected forces in society, and it functioned above the level of individual perceptions or intentions. And it worked to maintain the status quo in capitalist societies through such structures as zoning laws, economics, schools, and courts. Okay. So we're going to talk about something called eugenics. You all know what that is? Yeah. Eugenics now widely discredited as unscientific and as biased racially, obviously. Dude, you're like kind of, I like you're like very like paying good attention. You're like, yeah. So
I'm paying attention too.
good, no,
But I just.
you all are.
I can hear everyone.
No, I just like drunk. I was like,
Oh, the student. Yeah, no, I want to hear what you have to say.
yeah. So what's eugenics? Anybody want to kind of share?
The perfect gene and weeding out the weak genes.
Yeah.
Genetic lineage, to be improved through artificial selection.
Better the race,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Improve the race. That's like the idea. And here's like a poster of it. And only healthy seeds must be sown, and check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. Very, very popular in the early 20th century. Like this was actually quite a dominant and powerful way of looking at science and looking at race and populations. And the idea is that you want to improve the gene of the human population by getting rid of certain undesirable characteristics. What are those undesirable characteristics? Right, like that's where the problem is, right? It gets adopted into Nazism and it becomes about kind of bettering the Aryan race. So let's get rid of feeble-mindedness, or like is like something that they really didn't like, or like mental illness and like things that were kind of not fitting into like the white supremacist paradigm, basically. It's in terms of bodies, sexuality. Yeah, so it was like this racial science meant at developing like a specific kind of white person, and they were actually sterilizing people that they deemed should not reproduce. So, and they got quite powerful. So let me read this from here.
Still do it with animals.
Well, this is
Well, they're doing it
idea
with, yeah,
of all of our livestock and crops, but then applied to humans.
right. So
Yeah,
Should we do it then?
the humans, no.
Danny Vance.
Well, yes, because
Why?
because there it's goal oriented, right? We want to make it chicken that's tastier. We want to make
Your goal.
yeah, no, but that's the humans
No,
goal
I
in
understand.
farming.
Yeah,
no.
John, I'm just wondering.
I'm
about,
saying
like, if
that-
that's
Like this was the misapplication of something that allowed us to survive in all these different.
I think a lot of us in
Oh, well,
even
yeah,
today.
I mean, Monsanto.
so
Sorry.
Yeah,
so it's a science, but it's deeply embedded in a very racist society.
yeah,
This was
yeah.
a way of eliminating basically non-whites, right, non-desirable subjects. So it's deeply violent, and it's what influenced
Yeah.
like Nazism. This was very much the science of the racist, and what American eugenicists believe that degenerate behavior such as alcoholism, poverty, and social dependency were all caused by genetic defects, right? So like all of these social problems, because like there's social decay because of people and their like bad genes. It's like the cure for like social decay is through like basically eliminating people with bad genes. And this included like low IQs, feeble-mindedness, abnormal behavior, sexual promiscuity, criminal behavior, and they lobbied. The physicians actually lobbied to get these laws passed for sterilization, and the first one was passed in Indiana in 1907, and then they kind of expanded it, and ultimately 30 states had laws making sterilization legal for people with mental illness or feeble-mindedness. And as a result, around like 30,000 people were sterilized unknowingly between 1907 and 1939. And this was all in California. And who loved this idea? Hitler. Hitler loved this idea. He actually was studying the US, and he was quite impressed with the way that sterilizations happened in California. And there's like some more interesting history about the way that Nazi Germany studied the US and specifically Jim Crow laws. There's this historian called James Whitman, who's at Yale, and he documents ways that the Nazis were impressed by race laws. And specifically, like there's this one law of the one drop rule, which is if you have like one ancestor who's black, you're legally black and you can't marry white. And even the Nazis thought that this was like too much. They didn't, seriously, they had less strict laws about what it means for you to be a certain race. So that's just an interesting part of the history, and people get surprised. Why are we talking about eugenics? It's relevant to psychiatry. Do you know who Emil Kraepelin is? How did you know? Yeah. So Emil Kraepelin is the father of modern psychiatry. He is hugely influential into the DSM. He had this approach of classifying diseases. His approach was to look at observable symptoms and track the course. And this became what like the diagnostic criteria is. And this is what the DSM is all about. So Kraepelin was very influential, and in DSM-3, like there were a lot of new Kraepelinians that thought that he's the man, and this is what we should do. We should just take his approach to nosology and classification, and that's how we will do our diagnoses. Now, Kraepelin was a eugenicist. He wanted to improve the race of the German people. He was opposed to the welfare state because he thought that it's like interfering with natural selection, and it's helping weak people, and that's like not good for the general race. People argue that he was a proto-fascist. So like these ideas that he's coming up with in terms of how do we make the race better, how social decline is rooted in the genes, these were all ideas that made their way into fascism. And this is the father of modern psychiatry, okay? He came up with dementia praecox, which is what we now call schizophrenia. Okay? Dementia praecox means premature dementia. And he was basically looking at patients at the hospital who he described as initially being like very young and promising, and like they were great, and they slowly declined and became dull-minded. And he called this dementia praecox. So you can kind of recognize what he's talking about. He's probably like talking about like some negative symptoms, right? And for him, like this was a dismal prognosis, like you're just gonna end up with dementia. And he wasn't concerned with treatment. He was just kind of classifying, documenting symptoms, and kind of just being like, oh, I guess they'll just get dementia, basically not get better at all. Which, okay, so we'll get back to that in a second. He was very much a biological psychiatrist. He thought that this disease is rooted in the brain, and all diseases, psychiatric diseases, are generally rooted in the brain. Okay, and he was, like we're saying, kind of a eugenicist, and kind of really dabbling in this idea that people's genes, people's biologies are what make them undesirable, are what make them degenerates. So mental illness is located in biology in a very clear way for Kraepelin. And around this time in the US, where you're having like diagnoses like trichomania, where Black people have a brain disorder that makes them want to flee, Kraepelin's ideas became very appealing, right? Like this is a person who's giving an emphasis on brain biology, and it fits nicely into the idea that Blacks' brains were not fit for freedom. Okay, so you're not talking about social context, you're not talking about why they might want to flee, all that stuff. Is justification. It fit nicely with that. His paradigm, like the emphasis on brain biology, is what people, now we can see it as justification, but back then this was science. This is legit, right? So they weren't even, yeah, but it served to justify the status quo, for sure, like a very racist status quo. And so what you were getting is dementia precox, as described by Kraepelin, was a disease of others. It was a disease of them, like people who were kind of marginalized. Kind of sounds like smallpox, like dementia precox, like smallpox. Kind of sounds icky. He's talking about people who are just like kind of, yeah, very, very kind of stigmatizing diagnosis. And practically every mention of the illness in newspapers between like 1910 and 1930 mentioned it in reference to Black people, immigrants, criminals, and subnormals. So around this time, there was this kind of anxiety that America is going to be overrun by people, aliens with dementia precox is what they called them. They felt like kind of just people are just going to come in here and they're like insane and they're going to invade this country. And there's a lot of kind of popular reports in journalism about high-profile crimes committed by crazy people, and they were thought to have like dementia precox. So you're getting this association between dementia precox and the subnormals, people who are outsiders, like people who are marginalized, right? And people were actually saying we should go to the steamships to the immigrants and test them for dementia precox, and whoever has it should be deported, shouldn't come in. They're also suggesting like the American eugenics movement wanted to go out to the prisons, to the criminals, test them for dementia precox, and sterilize those who have it. So very, very kind of eugenicist, very biological, very much linked with criminality and kind of undesirable. Okay, that's dementia precox as a brain disease, and as the first definition of what we now call schizophrenia.
Also linking mental health with violence.
Yes, very much. With criminality.
So an
with,
early,
yes.
linking of mental illness with people with violence.
Yeah. And then Kraepelin's student, Eugene Bleuler, he came up with schizophrenia. He thought that this is actually not dementia. It's, it's quite different. What it is, according to Bleuler, is it's a splitting of the basic functions of the personality, right? So here you have schizo, which is splitting, phrenia, from mind, okay? And Bleuler was very much psychoanalytically based, okay? So for him, this was not a biological disorder. This was a splitting in the personality. And there was like a heated exchange between Bleuler and Kraepelin, and like kind of a lot of back and forth. Schizophrenia eventually won out as the term that we use today. And it's for complicated reasons. One of them is that, dementia precox doesn't accurately describe the prognosis, right? We know that more than half of the patients with schizophrenia get better. And there was something about schizophrenia, the way that he laid out the term, that's very seamlessly aligned with psychoanalytic ideas about the split mind, the unconscious versus conscious. So it just kind of it felt more kind of it fit more nicely with the ethos of the time. And so when it crossed the Atlantic between 1920s and 1950s, doctors and the public frequently linked this definition, schizophrenia, not with the marginalized, like we know how we're talking about like with people who are violent, the people who are like immigrants and invading the country. No, they linked it with the mainstream, even though it's literally, they're talking about the same thing, right? But something about the way that Bleuler's kind of termed it and its associations, it was associated not with the Black body, but with the white mind. So you can see like interesting ways that the press was talking about schizophrenia. So you have like this New York Times article, 1936, that was called "The Psychic Ills That Trouble Us," and it was describing the pressures of civilization and living in like a civilization and how that caused schizophrenia. So here you're getting troubles us, right? And us is like people in society as opposed to people who are invading it. So psychiatrists were like frequently highlighting the insistence that schizophrenia was an illness of personality instead of biology. And the descriptions of the patients with schizophrenia remained largely free of connections to violence, invasions, crime, impurity, or other eugenic status, right? In fact, schizophrenics were described as academics, poets, eccentrics, and people who might have deviated from the norm, but they're still largely within it. Okay. And here, psychiatric textbooks describe schizophrenia as a disease of white male genius, it's a disorder of feeling and thinking, and they were sensitive. Okay. So here you have two words for the same thing, right? One of them gets these connotations that are more kind of about criminality, about people who are undesirable, people who are violent. And the other one is more kind of about a sensitive, white, intellectual, right? And these two different connotations are they have huge implications for the patient, but they're describing the same thing, right? They're talking about the same thing. So it's interesting now for us when we kind of think about it. The social attitudes and the context of the diagnostic label have a huge role in the function that label plays. Okay. And here you can see an early ad about the reserpine, antipsychotic, and you can see that it's kind of tailored specifically for. Here you have, it says clean, cooperative, and communicative respirate, and you have a white woman kind of very gently knitting here. So this is the target population for schizophrenia in the early 50s. Okay. The thing is, at this time, psychoanalysis in the US was dominant. It was dominant force, and schizophrenia, because of Luhler's psychoanalytic background, and because of his emphasis as this kind of being a split in personality, it made it way more likely for the public to confuse schizophrenia with neurosis, which is a far more kind of benign symptom cluster in white, middle class, anxious and obsessive women. That was the stereotype for neurosis. So you have that for neurosis, and then you have schizophrenia that is now being conflated with it. Right now, there isn't much of a difference in the public's imaginary between neurosis and schizophrenia, and you can see very interesting kind of article titles in popular magazines "Are we all going quietly mad?" Right? Again, disease of the mainstream. Are we all going quietly mad? Right? Or don't tell them we're all going crazy. Right? Which again, in the mainstream. And then this interesting title is "Are you neurotic now? And if you are, does it mean that tomorrow you'll be psychotic or schizophrenic?" Okay. So you're getting here that schizophrenia as a disease of the familiar. It's getting identified with a certain kind of group of people and rendering other people invisible. And very much a disease of white middle class women at this point in history. Okay. Enter the 60s. Okay, very different advertisement. You have this James Brown figure. You have behind them this city on fire, which is referencing the civil unrest in the 60s and the race riots. And it's saying assaultive and belligerent. Cooperation often begins with Haldor, right? And obviously you're a white physician who's being told to be scared of this black man, right? So what's going on in the 60s that is kind of compelling this change?
Civil rights.
Yeah, so you're having civil rights that are getting increasingly more confrontational. You're having way more racial tensions. You have Black Power activists. You have the Black Panther Party. They got guns. You have the Nation of Islam. You have Malcolm X. People are changing their names to Muslim names. America is freaking out, basically. The racial tensions are very high, and it was slowly developing and catalyzing associations between schizophrenia, criminality, and violence. Okay, so now you're starting to get a different association with schizophrenia. And this book here, The Protest Psychosis, by Jonathan Metzl, who's a Vanderbilt psychiatrist, he's a sociologist, goes into very incredible detail to this kind of change. And he takes this one hospital in Michigan, Ionia, and he looks at these patterns, right? So in the 60s, admission of Black schizophrenic men went up by 60%. And schizophrenia was now way more likely to be diagnosed to a Black patient. It was given to 88% of Black admissions compared to 44% of white admissions. And it kind of goes into like the details. It goes into like some case reports. And there's like this example that I remember of a Black patient who changed his name to like a Muslim name. And in the case report, there is nothing that you would recognize now as being psychotic. But this patient was being called paranoid against white men and kind of is very erratic and agitated. And this was a very typical patient in the hospital at that time. Okay?
So like somebody who was opposed to whatever rules that the governing body.
A Black man who was criticizing whiteness.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not necessarily like hallucinating.
No,
But
nothing like that. Just a different name, refusing to talk to the white doctor, calling like saying white devil, stuff like that. Yeah, just like things that if you look at the context, that was quite normal behavior for a specific group of activists, right? And a specific kind of Black kind of power culture. Well, this was getting pathologized and kind of labeled schizophrenic.
And the paranoia was rational and accurate.
Well, yeah,
what they were
so,
calling paranoia.
Yeah.
right. So they were calling it paranoia, and it wasn't really paranoia,
Right.
right? Or at least right.
Right.
Yeah. Right. More interestingly, is how we were talking that this was like a disease of white middle class women. He goes into some case reports of some women, and one that comes to mind is she was what we would recognize today as severely psychotic, really kind of disturbed. And around this time, her diagnosis was changed from schizophrenia to depression. Okay, so you're getting this very clear and deliberate shifting of what it means to be schizophrenic. Okay, and this was around the time of the institutionalization where people were being let go, but a different group of people were being kind of admitted and maintained. And these were what we were talking about. These were Black activists and people who were a threat in some way to like the white kind of power structure. Okay, so within just like a century, you're getting like this, so many movements, so many identifications, so many different associations with one disease, right? Dementia precox, schizophrenia, whiteness, Blackness. So like this is all happening, and psychiatrists are practicing in this context. So just imagine that, right? Like it's a lot. Okay. So the legacy of this kind of thing that we were just talking about, and how schizophrenia became a Black disease, is that nowadays, I don't know if you know this, but Black patients are 4 times as likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. So to this day, Black people are often misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. There's like this huge imbalance, 4 times, right? That's crazy. That's a big number. And the other thing is schizophrenia remains associated with violence, right? And criminality. That's kind of a dangerous thing. And we're talking a little bit about biological psychiatry, and it's an interesting historical process how these things develop, right? We started off with Kraepelin, very biological, all the problems are in the brain. The pendulum moved to like psychoanalysis, and that became kind of the more dominant force. Everything was in the personality, everything was in the mind, there was neglect of biology. In the 80s, there was a move back to biological psychiatry, and that's where we're at right now. Some people say that right now there's a move, the pendulum swinging again away from biological psychiatry. I think so. We'll see, but that's kind of the way that things shift. Now, if you think about one of the main criticisms of Kraepelin, the DSM-5 approach and biological psychiatry, is that this emphasis on symptoms, where you're only interested in kind of classifying and looking at the course and the symptoms, what it does is you end up neglecting the patient's story, right? So who cares? And if you think about it, that makes sense for Kraepelin, because that guy was a eugenicist. He didn't care about your story. You're a degenerate.
Mhm.
But it's interesting that this is something that persists today in the DSM, where still we're kind of in this position of classifying, looking at symptoms, not really attuning to the story. Now, I'm like before we get into this, like I'm trained in medicine, right? I did a year of internal medicine, psychiatrist, prescribed meds. Very important. Biology is very important, right? But it's important to also be critical of what it means to be a psychiatrist and kind of look at where we're at and see how things have panned out, right? And there was a lot of hype about this biological psychiatry. In the 90s, George Bush said that this is going to be the decade of the brain. Okay? Billions of dollars were poured into brain research. People thought that we're going to get biomarkers, that eventually you're going to diagnose mental illness with like a blood draw or like a brain scan. Like people genuinely believe this, and like billions and billions of dollars went into it. I mean, here we are 30 years later. There hasn't been any breakthroughs in understanding or in treatment, right? There not much really. It's kind of been a failure, and this is not just like me talking, right? Let's look at this guy. His name is Thomas Insel. He's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and he says, "I spent 13 years at NIMH pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back, I realized that while I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think 20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness, right? I think, in fact, nowadays, there's a higher rate of homelessness, and the life expectancy is like 10 to 20 years less than the average population. That's where we're at for the patients, right? So that's,
He said that a parent stood up once and said, like, you're discussing, he's like, you don't understand, where like our houses are on fire and you're discussing the composition of paint. Yeah. Like when he was presenting on some of the new research from NIMH, it was a father of a schizophrenic man. And he said, you don't understand, you're discussing, you're like, our houses are on fire. We are in an acute crisis, and you're talking about
that's such a good metaphor.
yeah. And you're talking about the composition of paint.
Yeah.
Like maybe it could be this receptor.
You just bring up, actually, there's this guy called Pat Bracken. He's a critical psychiatrist in Ireland. He has this paper called Towards a Hermeneutic Psychiatry, right? And in it, he describes like what is bioreductionism, what is biological psychiatry. It's trying to understand the painting through like looking at the components, kind of composition of like the paint or whatever. It's like this very bioreduction. You don't have any idea what the actual painting is. You're just kind of honing in on this very kind of irrelevant, minute detail. And yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting perspectives that get brought up, and
I feel like you could see a lot in between the even the like the patients or the people who were slaves and then diagnosed with something that made them want to be free, is like the same as it's taking an individual out of their context entirely. And I feel like we do that a lot also with medicine too.
yes,
And so we end up taking their personhood away in order to give them the disease.
Yeah, exactly. And
Sorry.
the way to like, I agree with you that this is an inheritance, like this individualism, like as an assumption of Euro-American psychology and psychiatry, runs deep, isn't tenable in a certain way, like to help patients and to understand patients, but it is serving this role of shoring up kind of the status quo and not examining different structures that are probably playing an important role in the psychopathology, right? So hopefully shifting more to like social determinants of health, things of that sort could help us understand things better and situate the patients better, as opposed to saying it's in your brain, right? And like that's all I can tell you, and kind of move on. Especially when we look at the way that these things are, the context, right? Like this is
It's like calling a sunburn, well, it's in your skin.
right. And let's not forget about the eugenicist core to this. Right? There's something deeply eugenicist about this, and it gets very radical.
But we shouldn't have to do that from scratch, right? Like it seems
Exactly.
like
So,
it would be to look at
exactly.
other
So the
cultures.
pendulum swings while maintaining the discoveries and the insight. It's not like so. Yeah. So it doesn't just like completely abandon stuff. That's the way that's.
Well, but if there is a biological component, then every human society has dealt with what we're calling schizophrenia throughout time. And we can look at more functional societies and how they dealt with that.
We're gonna get into that.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into some of that. Yeah. Cool. I'm glad you mentioned it. Okay. So what if we were to chill out for a bit, right, and kind of stop and be humble for a little bit and try to understand the story that's being told from the person with lived experience. What would that look like? And this is a book called Emancipatory Perspectives on Madness. It's very good. It goes into, it has some clinicians, it has some people with lived experience, and they offer up their perspectives on what it means to have psychosis and to be mad. And there's something ethical, right, in this activity of letting the patient define themselves. And that alone is very important. And we'll see that kind of corroborated in some literary in some literature, right? Such as this study with Lissaker, and it was like a review of the idea of insight, right? So if a person does not have insight, they're less likely to take their medications, right? They have insight, they're more likely to take their medications, they're more likely to have less symptom reduction. But the paradox is, if a patient accepts the label and has an explanation of their experience as like a disease, they're more likely to be demoralized, suffer depression, and have a poor quality of life. Okay? And this other review found that people who recovered from schizophrenia were more likely to have this identified from being sick, right? So what you're sensing here is that the narrative that the person pieces together about their experience, the story that they tell themselves, the meaning that they come to terms with, is vital for recovery. Okay?
You're the only one who thought. I did a talk on narrative psychiatry.
Huh?
Yeah. I was like, yes, I really like it. Go ahead.
Awesome. So what are some of those other perspectives on madness, right? These are all quotes from the book. Some of them are really good. So this one here, psychosis is not a meaningless aberration conditioned by less than ideal circumstances in the gene pool and or childhood environment, but an unshakable commitment to express a particular message, right? That's very different from what we think of psychosis as. Another one, this from a collective. We believe we have a dangerous gift to be cultivated and taken care of rather than a disease or disorder to be cured or eliminated. I like this one. A psychotic is a mystic who lost their way. Not an aberrant sickness, but a normative response to horrifying circumstances. We view madness as a process that, with patience and care, can bring about regeneration, renewal, and growth. And we may in turn meet the struggles of the world stage with the same faith that within the turmoil, there's a striving towards something meaningful. Okay. And this one, are you like madness as a symbolic language addressing politically dangerous truths, which reveals a fault within existing social structures that needs to be examined. So, I mean, I'm not saying that we should stop being psychiatrists or that we should let our patients treat themselves, right? But you know, I'm saying to be humble, right? Even in the field where you're an expert, it's very important for patients to integrate their experiences with their own meaning-making process. Okay. And there are very incredible people who have lived experience and have a lot to teach us. I don't know if you know Ellen Sachs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's great. She wrote The Center Cannot Hold. She gave her grand rounds here. Brilliant person, a lot to teach you as a psychiatrist. So a very different model from like the disease model, right? When we were talking about, this is very vital too. Okay, and going to John's point, we're talking a little bit about how certain norms, cultures, social dynamics influence and shape knowledge and practices, right? Social attitudes are not separate from what we describe as objective science, right? There's a relationship there. And I'll tell you about this very interesting body of research in cross-cultural psychiatry. So one very well corroborated finding from cross-cultural psychiatry is that patients with schizophrenia in the global South have better outcomes than in North America. Okay? And this was like, in particular, this was 3 WHO studies, and they looked at how the percentage of patients that have complete remission or like they just have better quality, like better function. Okay. Now the question is why? Why is it that people in the global South with schizophrenia do better? It's unclear. They don't know. But there's a very interesting suggestion that it's because of the psychosis itself. The very experience of psychosis, the quality of the psychosis is different. Okay? So there's this qualitative study carried out in Stanford by Tanya Luhrmann, and it found that patients in the USA were more likely to report violent commands than those in India and Ghana, who are more likely to report rich relationships with their voices and less likely to describe the voices as the sign of a violated mind. Okay. Now, bear this in mind, right? This is something that we know from CBT for psychosis. It's not the hallucinations and the psychotic symptoms themselves that are distressing, it's the beliefs that you have about them, right? So there's something about these cultures in the global South that helps the patient adopt a more relational attitude towards their voices, right? And the answer is probably because their very conception of a mind, their very idea of what it means to be a self, is different. So in the US, in the North America, in the West, it's a very individualistic understanding of what it means to have a self, to have a mind, to be a self. It's kind of like you get this image of almost like a private container, right? And here you have like questions like the first rank symptoms of schizophrenia, like, do you feel like thoughts are being inserted, thoughts are being withdrawn? You're getting like this implicit image of a container where thoughts get inserted and get withdrawn. If you ask a patient in Ghana or in India about thought insertion and broadcast, they don't get what you're talking about. It doesn't make sense. Because at a very fundamental level, they don't make the same assumptions about what it means to have a mind. They have a very collective kind of relationality. Okay? And this is why the auditory hallucinations themselves are different. They're not as distressed. It doesn't seem like there's this voice intruding on my private space. It doesn't get experienced that way. Yeah? So what you're sensing here is that the very idea that you have about what it means to be a mind, that's relevant to the psychotic symptoms that you have. And it matters for prognosis. It's a better prognosis. You know? So that's a very interesting finding. And it goes back into like what Molly was saying in terms of there's like this individualistic assumption that it seems sus, right? It's like it's not right. It's like doesn't make it's not like science.
But was it related at all to kind of the spiritual beliefs of the culture, like a more materialistic Western approach versus a more?
It was correlated with the collective, with this like kind of sense of self as being collective versus individualistic.
But not just spirituality, which the idea that like
I don't know
that we're more than
I don't know how much of these say it again.
That we're more than just a collection of items.
It's correlated with. I mean, if you also think about the symptom itself, right? It looks a certain way when a certain culture has a certain image of a mind.
Yeah, no, I get that, but it's also kind of the connection of not just the self to others, but the self to the physical and to the metaphysical.
I can share with you the paper and you
Yeah,
can
like,
look into
yeah,
it. And,
like-
yeah, if you're
yeah.
interested. Okay. So to wrap up,
There's like the concept of a self beyond the body.
Right, it was in that, it had more to do with the culture.
right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, so this is about, like I was saying, it was about collective subjectivity versus individualistic subjectivity, like the sense of self.
Right, but even that can be confounded by a materialistic perspective versus the idea that like we are connected by something more than just genes, right?
Mhm. Oh no, I assure you that that's not how people think, like outside, like in that particular context.
Right, right. So that's what I'm saying, that like that sense of the mind being connected to other people in a more fluid dynamic sense.
Yeah.
Could be, well, it's tied in with this idea of the mind being more than just
Yeah,
like
so
the
the
brain.
idea of the mind
Yeah.
being more of the brain, that's a Euro-American assumption. Yeah, that's a very, if you, we were talking a little bit about this, like in our last lecture. It's not separate from colonial modernity, right?
Yeah.
Its origins are in cogito ergo sum, Descartes, I think therefore I am.
Yeah.
And it's linked to an idea of Europe as the center of the world, and it's also linked of what it means to have a body and to have mind. It's very complex.
Yeah. No,
But it's not,
back to
it's
awareness.
yeah, it's
yeah.
inseparable from this very colonial Eurocentric history, right? This individualism.
Mhm.
It's an assumption of a very specific kind of way of organizing the world,
Mhm.
and it ties into capitalism too. Like individualism in general has its own history, and it's rooted in like Euro-American exploitation of the world
Mhm.
and emergence of capitalism on the backs of this exploitation.
Yeah.
So its own history is like kind of tangled up in these questions.
Yeah, and the words we use are gonna carry that, like,
Yeah.
but anyway, okay.
So that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about the way that certain assumptions, like individualism, right, and like positivism, where it's like you only care about what you can observe and what you can see, and then ahistoricism, the idea that throughout history and throughout different cultures, it's the same disease, it doesn't change. These are all too simplistic, right? We see that culture and social context not only shapes our understanding of ourselves and our knowledge, but most things, really, everything in a way, and also mental illness itself, right? So we talked about history like a week ago. Today we went to psychiatry. We'll get more into psychotherapy next week, okay? Any questions about what we talked about?
Lecture, do you mind just clicking on the child carriers just to?
Yeah.
If what, maybe the other people can do that.
But that's true for other mental illnesses, not just schizophrenia, that like the phenotypic presentation is different from like the genotypic like presence of pathology based on a more community-centered like cultural philosophy. And even though I think it's like good to highlight that like a lot of patients who were violent were like given a diagnosis of schizophrenia, like research shows that 7% of patients with schizophrenia are going to commit like an extremely violent act resulting in like death or dismemberment of somebody. And like I defended mentally ill people, and they're most often the victim of crime. But I think as psychiatrists, we need to remember that there is that 7% that are at risk of violence as a product of having the illness.
Yeah. And again, the point is, Dr. Lewis will make a point to let you know that yes, patients with schizophrenia statistically will commit more crimes. Nonetheless, again, they are far more likely to be the
No,
victim.
and I agree with that. I just
But there's something about the way that schizophrenia gets imagined,
Mhm.
conceptualized,
no,
understood.
and I
It
totally
becomes
agree with that.
like a fear,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I think a lot of that though is like these like these news stories like that, mental patient with schizophrenia in the New York subway who pushed that, you know, woman to her death, and then those stories become kind of like poster child for like.
So everybody thinks this is visually ill person.
And yeah, and then it's such like a kind of a horrific thing. And that's, you know, why the New York City like has decided to kind of remove the mentally ill from the streets, like despite not meeting kind of commitment criteria.
So that's a good example about how social attitudes and fears kind of drive something that we think we should be doing because of care, right? But it's not.
I think there's a definite recognition though that like part of this is driven by these like very scary incidents that were caused by.
But it's interesting that these are the incidents that draw our attention, right?
Exactly.
Because there are a lot of scary incidents that are as scary that and as horrifying that don't get talked about in this one.
Yes, or the violence done against patients with schizophrenia, you know, like
Right.
that doesn't get.
Right, so it becomes, yeah, and there's something about the associations within schizophrenia and blackness that we're talking about the history that renders it more kind of, I think, susceptible to like these kinds of social identifications and reactions. So like these are all kind of part of this response.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the idea of many of these diseases being on different spectrums is helping to challenge that kind of idea of like other. Whereas like, then you can start seeing there are people who have like near psychosis versus, and then not, who are not necessarily all the way into like a psychosis.
It's a far more human experience
Yeah.
than it's kind of made out to see.
Right, and then it can seem more like something that you yourself could enter into or experience or not, because it's just a human brain after all.
Unless we're still placing people on these spectrums because of racist assumptions, right, or social assumptions. Which I imagine we probably are.
Oh, for sure.
So,
Cool, well,
That's
so good to
Yeah,
talk
I
to you all.
know.
This is great, yeah.
How many more of these?
Just one more, and it's gonna be mostly about therapy. Yes.
You want to schedule a few more?
Oh, I'm down, dude.
yeah, no, this.
I really enjoyed talking to all of you and, yeah. So I post this?
Yeah, I think we're done. Yeah, there's nothing in there.
You're welcome, Zoom people. I'll send out the study that I was talking about. That
Yeah.
Hillary's interested in.
Is that the one? Well, so.
This is the qualitative study from Tanya Luhrmann.
But antisocial personalities that are also
Yeah.
in like the same grades.
No, not in southeastern